But there's always one bastard out there, and I never let them get to me.
Industry insiders whispered about it, but no one dared speak publicly. The man known as rock's most peaceful drummer carried a secret list of musical enemies. Beyond his famous grin and those flashing peace signs, Ringo Starr quietly judged, dismissed, and in some cases outright despised certain bands that crossed his path. From backstage snubs to philosophical betrayals, the quiet Beatles' private disdain reveals a side of rock history you've never heard before. We've uncovered the 6 bands that earned Ringo's silent scorn. These weren't just musical disagreements, they were personal betrayals that cut to the core of what the Beatles stood for. From rhythm section rivalries that shaped rock history to bands that dared challenge the Fab Four's legacy, these are the tensions that defined the quiet Beatles' true feelings. Prepare to see Ringo Starr in a completely new light. Not as the smiling drummer, but as the keeper of a musical blacklist that reveals the real battles behind rock's golden age. First up, a band whose rivalry with the Beatles ran deeper than anyone imagined, the Rolling Stones. Number 1, the Rolling Stones. Rivals in rhythm. They were the kings of cool, the bad boys to the Beatles' charm. But behind closed doors, the so-called friendship was paper thin. It's the rivalry everyone knew about, but not the deeper philosophical divide that insiders witnessed. In the early 60s, the Beatles and Rolling Stones were Britain's twin musical titans. On the surface, all smiles and shared stages. Beyond the press photos, pure tension, especially between rhythm sections competing for rock immortality. Music historians note that while the bands maintained public friendliness, their drummers stood for completely different philosophies. Charlie Watts was the jazz-trained perfectionist. Ringo was the instinctive groove master who valued feel over technique. To Ringo, it wasn't about flashy fills or speed, it was serving the song. Feel over flash, groove over ego. What made the bands different, according to those who worked with both, was that simplicity wasn't laziness but precision. The Beatles didn't need to prove anything, the Stones always did. This basic difference in approach created an unspoken tension that lasted decades. Studio engineers recall how the drummers would stay politely professional in public, but their respect was purely professional. Even as time softened their public rivalry, the philosophical gap remained. Privately, according to those close to Ringo, he viewed the Stones as talented, but lacking the collaborative spirit that made the Beatles special. To him, it wasn't about charts, it was about soul. And when that soul was questioned by the next generation of musicians, the lines became even sharper. Because the next band on his list didn't just challenge his playing, they challenged the Beatles themselves. Number 2, Oasis. Fast forward to the 90s, and Ringo's back in the spotlight. No longer just a drummer, but a rock legend, solo artist, and one of the last standing pillars of British music history. Enter Oasis. The Gallagher brothers stormed into the scene like a brawl set to music. Swagger, sneers, and stadium-shaking anthems. The media crowned them heirs to the Beatles' throne. They didn't just admire the Fab Four, they worshipped them. But according to music insiders, Ringo saw through the facade. The admiration felt hollow, loving the image, not the substance. What the Gallaghers borrowed in sound, they lacked in spirit. They plastered Beatles references everywhere, from interviews to album art. Behind the scenes, those who witnessed interactions said the admiration felt more like calculated exploitation. The breaking point came through Noel Gallagher's notorious arrogance, his infamous boasts about being bigger than the Beatles, and dismissive comments about the original Fab Four's legacy struck those who knew Ringo as particularly galling. John Lennon's controversial "bigger than Jesus" comment came from a genuine observation about society, but Noel's declarations seemed driven by pure ego. Music industry veterans describe Ringo's reaction as quiet disappointment rather than anger. He recognized the talent, but couldn't stomach the attitude. The Gallaghers represented everything he felt was wrong with modern rock: style over substance, arrogance over authenticity. According to those close to him, Ringo viewed Oasis as talented mimics who missed the point entirely. Imitation without intention, as one friend paraphrased his feelings. To Ringo, Oasis was everything the Beatles weren't: brash for brashness alone, empty bravado instead of emotional depth. But if Oasis tested his patience, the next band did something worse. They didn't just disrespect the Beatles, they tried to destroy everything they stood for. Number 3, the Sex Pistols. While Oasis mimicked the Beatles' sound, the Sex Pistols took a more destructive approach. They deliberately attacked everything the Fab Four represented. Ringo's feelings about punk weren't simple. He valued its raw energy and defiance. Bands like The Clash, he saw real anger there, authentic rebellion. But the Sex Pistols, that was different. They weren't angry, Ringo once confided to a friend. They were calculated. By the late 70s, the Beatles had become mythical. Their legacy was set in stone, and the Sex Pistols knew exactly what they were doing when they targeted it. Johnny Rotten called them overrated hippies in interviews. During a notorious 1976 concert at London's 100 Club, Sid Vicious went further. He dedicated a song to the 4 musical prostitutes who sold out to America. He later sneered that Ringo was just a clock with arms, not an artist, just a human metronome. Ringo stayed quiet publicly. Not his style, but privately. He was fuming. To him, music was about connection through rhythm and melody. What the Pistols offered was destruction in leather jackets. The final straw? Hearing Malcolm McLaren, the band's manager, boast that provoking Beatles fans was their marketing strategy. "We know exactly which buttons to push," McLaren smirked. "That's not music," Ringo told a studio engineer. "That's a circus act." He never played their records, never mentioned them in interviews. To him, they weren't rebels. They were businessmen selling shock. While punk earned its place in music history, Ringo's verdict never changed. The Pistols weren't fighting the system. They were exploiting it. If the Sex Pistols attacked the Beatles through destruction, the Monkees took the opposite route. Their imitation was so blatant, it bordered on theft. And for Ringo, that was just as unforgivable. Number 4, the Monkees. In 1966, TV executives created the perfect money-making scheme, their own Beatles. The Monkees emerged from casting calls, not garage jam sessions. Initially, Ringo found it amusing. The copied hairstyles, the slapstick humour, harmless entertainment, right? Then headlines changed everything. Monkees outsell Beatles. America's new Fab Four. What began as flattery had become direct competition. The media positioned them as replacements, not tributes. For Ringo, the breaking point was discovering the deception. Studio musicians secretly recorded while the Monkees merely posed with instruments for cameras. This was everything the Beatles had fought against. "They were selling a lie," Ringo later confided. "We played 8 hours a night until our fingers bled. They spent afternoons learning how to look like they were playing." The Monkees eventually gained creative control and became legitimate musicians. They reached out repeatedly with backstage passes, jam session invitations, and personal notes. Ringo returned every envelope unopened. At a 1968 industry event, Davy Jones approached with an extended hand. Witnesses saw Ringo turn away without a word, leaving Jones standing alone. Some lines couldn't be uncrossed. "I don't hate them as people," Ringo admitted later. "I hate what they represent. You can't manufacture soul." Decades later, when asked about the Monkees, Ringo would offer that tight smile before changing the subject. To him, they represented the industry trying to turn music into a formula, something he could never forgive. But if the Monkees wounded Ringo's belief in musical authenticity, the next band on his list struck at something even more personal, his identity as a performer. Number 5, the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys weren't just California dreamers, they were the only band that made the Beatles nervous. Their harmonies floated like angels, while their lyrics cut straight to the teenage heart. And Ringo, he admired them, until one night changed everything. In a hotel lounge after a 67 show, Mike Love's voice carried, "The Beatles, studio tricksters, couldn't play live without smoke and mirrors." Ringo never confronted him, but something died that night, a respect that would never return. The rivalry between the two bands had always been friendly competition. Brian Wilson's Pet Sounds pushed the Beatles to create Sgt. Pepper. The Beatles' Rubber Soul inspired Wilson's greatest work. It was musical chess between giants. But Love's comments crossed from competition into contempt. What hurt most wasn't the criticism of Ringo's playing. It was dismissing years of hard work as mere tricks. Years later, Ringo would say, "Brian Wilson built symphonies out of sunshine. Pure genius. Some of the others? Big mouths and small minds." At a charity event in 1975, Love approached Ringo with outstretched arms. Witnesses saw Ringo simply turn away, leaving Love standing awkwardly alone. The message was clear. Some bridges can't be rebuilt. For Ringo, the Beach Boys represented a painful lesson that even your musical peers could betray you with casual cruelty. Number 6. Led Zeppelin. And then there was Led Zeppelin, who represented everything the Beatles weren't. Raw power over melody, volume over harmony. And while Ringo respected their talent, he couldn't stand their approach. "They forgot the song," Ringo once told a friend. "All thunder, no lightning." The breaking point came in a London club, 1970. Already drunk, Bonham challenged Ringo to a drum-off. When Ringo politely declined, Bonham smirked. "Didn't think so, triangle player of Beatles." Ringo simply walked out with quiet dignity. "I respected his talent," he admitted years later, "but talent without taste is just noise." The philosophical gap between them was vast. Bonham played to impress. Ringo played to serve the song. One sought spotlight, the other sought harmony. Their drumming styles perfectly reflected their band's souls. Zeppelin's thunderous ego versus the Beatles' collective vision. At George Harrison's memorial concert in 2002, Ringo and Zeppelin's Jimmy Page briefly shared a stage. They were cordial, professional, but those close to Ringo noted how he kept his distance. Some wounds never fully heal. These bands, from the Stones to Zeppelin, all made the same mistake: underestimating the quiet Beatle. Why the quiet Beatle finally speaks. So why do these stories matter now? Why examine the hidden tensions, when all parties could simply ride into the sunset with their legacies secure? Ringo Starr has grown from just the smiling Beatle behind the kit into something more powerful. He's a living witness to music history who's seen legends rise and fall. Time reveals truth. These untold stories about bands who crossed lines and challenged the Beatles' philosophy become more significant each passing year. Music historians can finally piece together the sanitized version of rock history where everyone supposedly got along. These 6 bands didn't just clash with his musical taste, they challenged his entire philosophy on what music should be. For someone who built his life on rhythm, peace, and genuine collaboration, those differences cut deeper than fans ever realized. Music insiders say understanding these tensions isn't about drama. It's because history deserves honesty. The stories of music's golden age shouldn't be airbrushed. Real rivalries existed. Real philosophical differences emerged. Real boundaries were crossed. Through careful observation by those closest to him, we see that Ringo's public silence wasn't indifference. It was dignity. But the memories remained, shaping not just his career, but his entire approach to the music industry. What drove these feelings was protecting what the Beatles truly stood for. Not the commercialized image, but 4 lads who changed everything through hard work, innovation, and respect for the craft. These tensions shaped not just Ringo's career, but his public image. The peace signs and smiles became his armor. Behind them, he carried these memories like stones in his pocket, heavy but hidden from view. Even behind the beat, the quietest one remembers everything. Through the observations of those who knew him best, We can finally understand how these conflicts shaped rock history's most peaceful soul. As the keeper of the Beatles' rhythmic legacy, these revelations aren't just settling old scores, they're revealing the truth of rock history, one long-held tension at a time.